All right. We are now in chapter 3 of Geography 101, talking about the world population. And the overarching theme of anything is that in the past 200 years, we've seen a population increase at a faster rate than ever before in human history around the globe. So let's get right into it. These are live links, so that if you were to click on this on the PowerPoint, it would open it up. I'm also going to include them in the D2L, but if you go on the first one, U.S. World and Population Clock, right? This is actually put out by the Census Bureau, and what this is a live counter of the population. Oh, look, here we go. Someone's going to get born in the U.S. right now, any second now. Here it comes. 6, almost, and, ding. Now, I'm just being a little silly, right? Obviously, that doesn't mean someone was born the exact minute. But what this does is we know in the United States, through data that we collect, that there is, on average, someone born every 8 seconds. So we just basically take how many people are born in a year and divide it by the number of seconds in a year, right? We also know there's a death every 12 seconds. So think about this question, right? If people are being born faster, or are they dying faster? The Jeopardy timer says time's up. There are more people dying than being born, right? So, did I get that right? Let's do the math. Every 8 seconds? No, there are more people being born, aren't there? See, even I can be wrong. This is why our population is increasing. If it was backwards, if people were dying faster than being born, right? For every one person being born, 5 are dying, but that's not the case. The other thing that affects it is migration. We know people move here. Every year, there are a recorded number of people who move here. There's probably even more that we don't record, right? So on average, our population is increasing by 1 person every 17 seconds. The world population, you can see, much faster. So interesting stuff. You can look at some of these things if you will. Another one, let me close that one out. World meters, this is a different group, and they do the same general thing, right? The world's population right now. But they look at some other interesting things right here. How many deaths today? How many bicycles were made this year? But you can click and change this. How many bicycles today? What about the society? How many cell phones? How many emails were sent today? Holy crap. Lots of emails. Lots of tweets going on. Different things. Now, as to how accurate this is, I guess that all depends on how much data you collect. I haven't clicked on this one. Let's look at this, coronavirus. As of right now, there are 6.9 million cases, right? And we could go through this by different countries, right? Different cases, different types of statistics, new, all that stuff. What these all get at, right? Let me go ahead and get back to our PowerPoint, right? Is that the world's population is rising. So right now, we are roughly about 7.5 billion. And what's interesting is, as far as we can tell, everyone alive today is related to a small group that left Africa probably about 100,000 years ago, as we watched in that movie, right? Now, up until the year 1800, so for about 95,000 years, population growth was very slow, if not steady. It wasn't about until the year 1800 that we see this huge, explosive growth, and that now we double. So when I was in high school back in the 70s, I'm just kidding, when I was born in the 70s, the population of the world was 3 billion. It's now less than 50 years later, it's doubled. And so it's doubling faster and faster. We also know through um, genetic research, actually, that there have been some issues in human history that have caused our population to shrink. I mentioned it in the last chapter that we now know with genetic evidence that there was something that happened 75,000 years ago that made the world population fall to about 10,000 people, right? And how do we know that? Well, we can look at our genes. There are 7.5 billion people in the world spread on every continent. When you look at the amount of diversity within our gene structures, the different types of genes that we have, based on that number of people over 100,000 years, we should have much more diversity, and we really don't. there's actually less diversity in our genes than would be otherwise supported, which means that something happened along our way to kind of limit that. Okay? So here we're talking about world population, right? And you can see that up until about the year 1800 is pretty slow. We were about 1 billion people at the most. But right about 1800, we start this process where it really takes off. Where today we're thinking probably within your lifetime, you might see 10 billion people. All of this from a very small population. Now, this overall growth does mask the fact that there have been declines in certain areas. So even though as a whole we've increased our number, not every part of the world had that happen. Things like disease, issues from climate change have caused the world's population to sometimes fall in some areas. So let's talk about the first one, disease. And you probably all now know what a pandemic is. I don't have to explain that to you. We're undergoing one right now. A pandemic is a disease that occurs on a worldwide or a large scale. There are times in the fall where maybe somebody in class gets the cold and everybody in our school maybe gets sick, but it's just Chicago or just our school. That's illness. That happens. A pandemic is like COVID-19, where there's basically cases of this on every continent in the world. It happens all over. Okay. Now, in the past, there's actually been 3 major pandemics. If you think this is bad, just wait. It's not even close. The first one is the bubonic plague. Now, the bubonic plague is a very fatal disease. I think the fatality is half of the people who caught the disease died of it. Very high. By comparison, I think COVID is about roughly 10 to 15%. So much more deadly. And there were several pandemics around the 6th to 8th century, so about the year 500 to 700, mainly in the Mediterranean area and in Europe. Okay, and this was spread by trade. Somebody was infected who maybe didn't know it, and as they moved from town to town selling their goods, they infected people in the market and so forth. At the time, it killed 25 million people. And this is in a time when the population of Europe was probably no more than maybe 70 million. So we're talking almost half the population. And it created widespread social confusion. And I've been wrestling long and hard. I was going to title this chapter, I Told You So. I give this lecture every year. And this was always a hard thing to get across to students. But you can now all see, with what's going on around us, how much social confusion there is with a disease that isn't as deadly. But when it affects society on a scale like this, it has ripples across all of it. Okay. The next major pandemic was the Black Death, and this occurs through most of Asia and Europe in about the 13 to 1400s. And this one was horrible. It would basically, in the space of 10 years, maybe kill off half the people, and the rest of them were sick. So imagine being in a society where within 10 years, half of everyone you know is dead. If we think we have things bad now, that was nothing even close to what it was then. And it rapidly and permanently changed civilization in Europe. One of the things it did was it changed the way we grow food. Before the Black Death, people grew food that they ate. So vegetables and wheat, and they did it with manpower. They did a lot of work. But if there's less farmers to grow vegetables. And so they turned to raising cows and goats and chicken, pastoral farming. It takes less people to do that. And so that was a rapid change in agriculture. It changed the basis of it. Wages went up. So wages went up. When the pandemic hit, if you were working at a supermarket, first of all, bless you for putting up with all the crap that you had to do. But secondly, a lot of places were offering bonuses, right? Because there were less workers. People were not coming in. People were sick. People couldn't come in for other reasons. Same thing with the Black Death. Wages had to go up because there were less workers available. Same thing with rents. Rent went down because there were less people to rent to because people died. I mean, that's the honest truth. So if there's less people looking to rent, then you have to charge less money, supply and demand. In Europe, the amount of forested land increased because there weren't people farming as much anymore. There were less people, smaller farms, and a lot of forests came back. All of these effects created mass unrest. In England, there was the Peasants' Revolt. This was a revolution of the people, right? The bottom of the ladder, who were putting up with loss of life, death, disease, and they almost overthrew the King of England. They came close to capturing him and killing him. This is probably one of the more famous paintings of the time. It's in a museum in the Netherlands, The Triumph of Death. This was painted at the height of the Black Death, and it looks like hell come to life. And in many ways, for people there, it was. They didn't have the modern knowledge of disease that we have, and they didn't know that this was a bacteria causing this. They thought this was God's will. You see soldiers fighting to keep the peasants in line. You see mass graves of people being dumped in. To this day, whenever they are working in London, England, and they're digging the foundations for a new building, they will often come across mass graves from the 1400s. So this just kind of gives you an idea of how society felt at the time. The last pandemic wasn't any one single disease, but it was a group of many that we basically have included what we call the Columbian encounter. So in 1492, Christopher Columbus, sails from Europe to America, and that is the beginning of the interactions between the Americas here and Europe, right? The old world and the new world. Columbus wasn't the first European to go to America. There were Vikings in Canada in the year 1000, but he was the first to start a permanent interaction. And so this begins the interaction of Europe and North America. And what happens is the Europeans bring with them several things. They bring with them animals to eat. So they bring cows and pigs. They bring horses to ride. There were no cow, pigs, or horses in the Americas before the Europeans came. They also brought crops like wheat and rye. Okay. Unfortunately, what they also brought with them when it came to terms of pandemic were diseases like smallpox, measles, influenza. You have to understand, it's hard to understand, before the Europeans came, there had never been measles in North America. There had never been the flu, because the virus originates here in Asia for the flu, or in Europe. And there was no interaction. If there's no one to bring the virus with them, it doesn't happen. So think about this, right? We know the COVID virus evolved somewhere in China, we think, and then it spread from there before we even knew it, right? Because people brought it. It doesn't happen on its own. If people had never gone from Europe to North America, there had never been that issue. These people had no immunity to the disease. And so what happens is diseases that the Europeans had and were immune to, like the measles or smallpox. Smallpox every so often would kill a lot of people in Europe. And either with smallpox, either you got it and you died, or you recovered and you were able to live with it, so you had some immunity. But if you went to a new population, like North America, where nobody had immunity, it spread rapidly, just as we've seen with COVID, very similar. So what happens is the European exchange, the Columbian encounter, we bring over things like cows, chickens, ducks, but we also bring over disease. And epidemics spread up and down through the Americas, as we're going to talk about in a little bit. The other side of the encounter that we'll talk about more in Chapter 4, but is interesting, is what did we take from the Americas? Well, one of the things were vegetables. Corn, potatoes, tobaccos, beans, peppers, cocoa, which is chocolate, squash. All these originate in the Americas. So corn is the most grown crop in the world, but it is actually from Mexico. That's where it was first domesticated. Potatoes, we think about Europe and Ireland eating potatoes, or Northern Europe. The potato was actually first cultivated here in what is now Peru. So those brought over. I find this fascinating. Hot peppers, chili peppers, jalapenos, ghost peppers, any pepper that has that hotness to it, they all came originally from Central America. Before 1500, there were no hot peppers in Chinese or Thai or Indian food. So that is the Columbian exchange. The last thing that I'll just touch upon, this map doesn't show you, and we will talk about more, is one of the biggest exchanges was people, not only from Europe, but the largest migration of people ever in human history, Africans brought to South America and North America, the slave trade. Not going to ignore that. We're just not going to cover it in this chapter. We will get into it. But let's get back to pandemics. So I'm going to pause it right here, and we're going to take up with the Columbian encounter in just a moment.